Hey, this is Dr. B, and in this video, I'll briefly discuss some ethical considerations when it comes to data visualization. Our readings this week go into a lot more detail, but I wanted to look at a few examples here and discuss some general guidelines for incorporating data visualizations into our own work, especially when we're designing those visualizations into data stories to communicate specific insights to our reader. Before we start, we have to ask the big picture question, why is visual communication so powerful? For those of us who are sighted, visual communication is very persuasive. Unfortunately, we can inadvertently fool ourselves and others when designing data visualizations. We can encode our own biases. We can use it to outright lie. It's very, very persuasive. As the old saying goes, seeing is believing, and sometimes we see things we want to see, not what is actually there. I like to say that visual communication is a lot like brain candy. And as we all know, candy isn't necessarily good for you. We need to understand how human beings reason to understand how things can go wrong. People like patterns, even when those patterns may be spurious or random. If we visualize data and spot a random pattern, we are very tempted to believe it's meaningful, even if it isn't. We tend to find stories more persuasive and engaging than a bunch of numbers, so data visualizations are very powerful. Humans like to be right, and so if we see something in a data viz that confirms our beliefs, we find it hard to let go. This is called confirmation bias, and it's really insidious because often we're not aware of it. These problems with reasoning are logical or rhetorical fallacies. They're what data designer Alberto Cairo calls mind bugs. We're all susceptible to these errors in reasoning. As designers, we can inadvertently encode them into our visualizations. Our readers then would be making bad decisions with bad information. So we need ethics to guide us as we develop data viz and make design decisions. So here are a few ethical guidelines. Be aware that these are the bare minimum. There are many sources out there on ethics and data visualization. I encourage you to do your own research, especially in the area of generative AI. Don't lie. This may be obvious, but it's a common problem in data viz. People will, for whatever reason, unconsciously or not, create misleading visualizations. I sometimes hear people say that it's really the reader's responsibility to decode the visualization and determine what's really going on, but that's BS. Making the conscious decision to design a visualization to trick a reader into thinking the data is saying something it's not is a lie, and the responsibility for those decisions lies with the designer. Here's a pretty well-known example. This graph depicts the number of gun deaths in Florida before and after a law called Stand Your Ground was passed. There are several problems with this graph. First, take a look at the x-axis. The years are not clearly labeled. When exactly does this start and when does it end? It's not clear if the chronology here is evenly spaced or if this has been altered to shape the trend to make it look like a steeper curve. Second, take a look at the y-axis. The way this kind of Cartesian mapping works is that the 0 of the y-axis and the 0 of the x-axis always intersect. Here, the y-axis is upside down. This fundamentally changes the way the data presents, is read, and is interpreted. You'll see that it appears as if gun deaths dropped after the enactment of the law, but in reality, they spike. This graph is lying. Whether it was intentional or not, the design choices here make this graph a liar. Be humane. Too often we focus on numbers and graphs and forget the real world is represented in those graphs. And the real world involves real people. Think about what a data viz leaves out as much as what it leaves in. Think about how people will be impacted by this data. For example, take a look at this Guide to AI Adoption by Visual Capitalist. What or whom is missing here? The people impacted by AI adoption in these industries. How many jobs may be lost or gained? How does this impact health and safety of real people? Same thing here. I don't think the designers are trying to be unethical, but what's getting lost in this beautiful visualization is the real devastation and ugliness of plastic pollution on the planet, animals, plants, and of course, people. Remember that visualization is a representation. It shouldn't oversimplify things, but clarify them. We have to leave some things out, but it's important to be mindful of what and how it changes our thinking. Remember that data visualization entails human decision making. It can get a little overwhelming, especially when we may inadvertently create something that's unethical or maybe just a little shady. Here are a few tips to guide your decision making. Ask yourself before, during, and after the visualization and design process, does this change the data and what it's saying? Or does it just focus the message that's there? Am I trying to be right or am I trying to be truthful? Am I creating empathy and connection or am I confirming my biases? Am I trying to hide something? What is the impact of this data on someone's decision making? Does the way I've designed this visualization changing that? Keeping the humanity in data visualization is challenging because they are necessarily an abstract representation of the world. Let's take another look at the Guardian article. Here, they've used a map to provide some context for this data and help us to connect it to the real world. They've broken the data up over 3 graphs and color-coded it to draw attention to the different causes of death. This means that we can't easily become overwhelmed and fail to make this connection. This type of emphasis is important for sitting with something that's uncomfortable, but important. You'll see too that the cause of death here is color-coded to match the dots, but also emphasize so we can't forget that we're really talking about here. And throughout the article, the writers use photographs of real people to contextualize all this information and to help us make this connection to real people. Sometimes the line between what is rhetorical and what is ethical can be blurry. Take this example. You can read this article in depth and make your own decision, but let me point out a few things. This infographic has long caused a debate. Is it deceptive? Is it unethical? In the original infographic, we have a histogram. The years are along the x-axis here, and the number of deaths along the y-axis here. At first glance, it may look like the gun death chart. However, the direction of the axes is correct. The 0 of the x-axis and the 0 of the y-axis intersect. Though the graph is flipped to give us this dripping blood effect, the integrity of the data is intact. This flipping of the graph doesn't fundamentally alter how we read the data. The reason this graph has been flipped and colored red is to draw attention to the human cost of this conflict. It draws our attention to the center, where there's a huge spike in the loss of life. It also emphasizes the loss of life overall, though it's calling attention to a specific area of the graph, and the design here is definitely focusing our attention in a specific way. The other data is not hidden or distorted, or is it? Anytime we call attention to the loss of life, I'd say we're probably making ethical decisions, don't you think? Here is an alternative design. The writers of this article have changed the orientation of the graph and then changed the color to blue. They feel that this is more neutral and allows for a different interpretation of the graph, that the deaths are actually declining. It's true this color doesn't draw the same emotional response, but is an emotional response necessarily unethical? It's true too that this particular visualization could be used to support a particular political agenda, but so too could this one. Does this mean that it's inherently more ethical? It's true that there's more than one way to interpret this graph, and different design decisions will focus the audience's attention on different areas of the graph to support a different interpretation. But that doesn't mean that the designer's choices were unethical, and this designer's choices were more ethical. I would argue this is just a good data story, and this is a different data story. I don't think this debate has been resolved, but I look forward to what you have to say on the discussion forums. That's all for now. If you have any questions, please hit me up on the discussion forums or reach out over email.